On a rainy night in Denver, Colorado, Sarah and Michael were heading home when they heard a faint cry coming from a dark alley. Curious and concerned, they approached and found a baby wrapped in a thin blanket, clearly abandoned. Michael looked around searching for someone, but all he found was the echo of his own footsteps on the deserted street. Without a second thought, Sarah picked up the baby, shielding it from the relentless rain. With a heavy heart, she felt the baby shiver from the cold and realized they had found the child just in time. They didn't know how long he could survive alone in that chill. As they hurried home, Michael used his own coat to create a sort of cozy nest for the little one. With each lightning flash, Sarah's worried face lit up in the darkness, and she pressed the baby against her chest, trying to warm him with her own body heat. The wind howled around the corners, but the couple barely felt the cold, focused only on protecting the life they had just saved. Upon arriving home, Michael rushed to prepare a bottle while Sarah, with trembling but gentle hands, changed the baby's wet clothes for something dry and warm. They wrapped him in a soft blanket and carefully placed him in a makeshift small bed. Watching the baby finally safe and beginning to fall asleep. After watching the baby sleep peacefully, Sarah and Michael finally had a moment to talk. Seated in the kitchen with hot cups of coffee, the silence between them was laden with unspoken questions. Michael, what now? What are we going to do? Sarah broke the silence, her voice filled with concern and affection for the little one. Michael sighed, running a hand through his still damp hair from the rain. Sarah, I can't bear the thought of leaving him in an orphanage. Not after bringing him home and seeing him so fragile, needing us. Sarah nodded, holding Michael's hand across the table. I feel the same way. Ever since I picked him up, something inside me has already accepted him as ours. Michael, I think we should keep him. Are you sure? I mean, we already have Oliver, will he understand? Will he accept a little brother all of a sudden? Oliver is a good boy, he will understand. Moreover, he will help. We'll teach him about compassion and love, about being a family. The decision seemed natural, almost as if the universe had planned that exact moment for them. After more talks and practical considerations, the name Samuel came up. It was strong and had a beautiful meaning, God has heard. To Sarah and Michael, the name was perfect because, in a way, they felt their prayers for a sign of what to do were answered with Samuel's arrival. In the days that followed, they introduced Samuel to Oliver, who, with the typical curiosity of his 5 years, accepted the brother with a mix of excitement and a bit of confusion. Is he going to stay with us forever? Oliver asked, his big eyes fixed on Samuel. Yes, Sarah replied, a smile spreading across her face. Samuel is your brother now, and we are going to take care of him together. Samuel quickly adapted to his new family. He grew up in a home where love and affection were the foundation of everything. For him, each day was a new discovery, and he explored the world with the bright eyes of someone who knows they are loved. The gratitude he felt for Sarah and Michael was evident, even though he was still young. He showed it through tight hugs, smacking goodnight kisses, and the way he followed them around the house, always wanting to be close. Oliver, who was 5 years old when Samuel arrived, took on the role of big brother with a mix of pride and initial jealousy. At first, he liked showing Samuel his toys and teaching him new games. But as Samuel began to walk and talk, the dynamics between them started to change. Oliver sometimes felt left out, as if Samuel was stealing the attention that used to be all his. Samuel, on the other hand, admired Oliver immensely. He saw him as a role model, a hero in miniature. When Oliver built a fort out of blankets, Samuel was always the first to enter. And when Oliver decided it was time to be pirates, Samuel promptly put on an imaginary hat and joined the adventure. However, their relationship was complex. As they grew, their interests began to diverge. Oliver found friends at school with whom he shared more interests, and his visits to the park with Samuel became less frequent. Samuel tried to keep up, running after his brother and his friends, trying to join in the conversations and games, but often felt like the little brother, a bit left out. Samuel didn't give up. He continued to try to catch Oliver's attention, asking about his day at school, showing him drawings he had made, hoping that maybe that would make him stay. But the more he tried, the more Oliver seemed to distance himself, now a teenager, engaging with new experiences and sometimes leaving Samuel feeling like he was in the shadow. Despite these challenges, the love and affection Samuel felt for his family never waned. He was deeply grateful for every family dinner, every night Sarah came to tuck him in, every outing with Michael to the park. Oliver had started hanging out with a group from school that liked to push boundaries. Parties, nocturnal escapades, and daring challenges were common, and he dove headfirst into this world. The values of care and responsibility that his parents tried so hard to instill in him were slowly being replaced by a desire to live in the moment, whatever the cost. Sarah and Michael's warnings often fell on deaf ears. "You need to think about the future, Oliver," Michael would say in their talks, which more resembled monologues. "These friends are not leading you down a good path." Oliver, with a shrug, would simply brush off his father's concerns with a careless smile. Dad, we're just having fun. We're young, that's what young people do." That was Oliver's standard response, a mantra he repeated to himself and to his parents, convincing himself that there were no consequences he couldn't handle. The nights out became more frequent, and with them, late calls from friends or even the police. A party that got out of hand, a challenge that went wrong, each incident was a blow to Sarah's heart, as she saw her son drifting further away from the boy he had been. Samuel watched all this with a mix of confusion and sadness. He didn't understand why Oliver chose those paths or why he ignored the advice of their parents. In his heart, there was a persistent hope that Oliver would eventually realize his mistake and return to the family that waited for him with open arms. But with each reckless decision, that hope became a bit more fragile. While Samuel leaned on family love, Oliver seemed to be searching for something he couldn't even define himself, lost in a quest for acceptance and thrill that took him further and further from home. The difference between the brothers was becoming more pronounced, outlining two very distinct futures emerging from the choices each made day after day. The family's routine was brutally interrupted on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Michael, who had always been a pillar of strength for everyone, suffered a fatal accident at the construction site where he worked. The news came as a devastating bolt of lightning to Sarah, who felt the ground disappear beneath her feet when two police officers knocked on her door with grim faces. Samuel, who was returning from school that day, found his mother desolate in the kitchen, her trembling hands trying to hold on to the coffee cup that spilled over with her sobs. The boy immediately understood that something terrible had happened, and his heart tightened at the sight of the pain in Sarah's eyes. He had always seen Michael as a hero, the man who, even though not his biological father, had chosen him as his son, taught him to ride a bike, to swim, and had defended him in every nighttime nightmare with unwavering patience and love. The news of the accident spread quickly, but Oliver was slow to return home. Distant and caught up in his own turmoil, the impact of his father's loss didn't find immediate room in his hardened heart from recent life choices. When he finally arrived home, his face was a mask of indifference that barely hid the emptiness he felt but did not know how to express. In the days that followed, while Sarah and Samuel shared in mourning, recalling stories and crying together, Oliver stayed on the sidelines. He watched the common grief with a coldness that frustrated even his attempts to connect. It seemed that for him, allowing himself to feel would be to admit that something was deeply wrong, not just with the situation, but with himself as well. The house, once full of laughter and plans for the future, now echoed with the absence of Michael. Every corner brought memories of happy times that now seemed to belong to another life, a life that Sarah, Samuel, and even Oliver, in his quietest and loneliest moments, desperately longed to recover. Soon after the tragic accident that took Michael, as the family was still trying to recover, another blow struck Sarah, a terminal illness diagnosis. The doctor delivered the news with visible sorrow, his words like a dense fog that settled not just in the cold hospital room, but over the entirety of Sarah and Samuel's lives. Samuel, grasping the severity of his mother's condition, instinctively took on the role of caregiver. At just 20 years old, he learned to prepare light meals that Sarah could eat, to manage her medications, and to keep the house in order, striving to bring some normalcy to their suddenly chaotic world. He spent sleepless nights researching his mother's illness, holding her hand during the worst bouts of pain, and always trying to keep a smile on his face so she wouldn't worry. Meanwhile, Oliver, now 25, seemed more and more like a stranger in his own home. Engulfed in his life of distractions and questionable choices, the reality of his mother's health condition seemed not to penetrate his bubble of denial. He visited Sarah occasionally, but these visits were brief and tense, with superficial conversations that seemed more to alleviate his own guilt than to comfort his mother or brother. During these rare visits, Oliver talked about his work and friends, avoiding looking into Sarah's eyes for too long, as if he feared that the gravity of her illness would drag him into a reality from which he preferred to escape. Samuel watched this with a mix of resentment and pity, wishing that Oliver could see beyond himself and recognize the value of the family moments that were quickly slipping away. The house, which once vibrated with Michael's loving presence, now seemed quieter and more somber. The laughter that once filled the hallways had been replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the sounds of the TV or the occasional muffled crying of Samuel, when the magnitude of his reality hit him in moments of solitude. Sarah's struggle was lonely despite Samuel's constant presence by her side, and Oliver's emotional distance only served to accentuate the chill that now seemed to permeate every corner of the home that once was filled with warmth and joy. When the compensation for Michael's death was finally released, Oliver reappeared as if driven by a financial radar. He who had been such a sporadic presence in the house that it no longer felt like home, suddenly returned, but his intentions were anything but familial. Oliver entered the door with a sense of urgency, avoiding Samuel's sad looks and Sarah's evident frailty. "So it's out?" was the first thing he asked, referring to the compensation money, without a greeting or a minimal sign of empathy for his mother's situation. Samuel, who was on the sofa reading a book, looked up at him with a mix of surprise and disappointment but nodded in affirmation. Sarah, trying to keep the peace, invited Oliver to sit down and at least have a cup of coffee. "Oliver, please, let's talk for a bit." "Don't worry, the compensation is secure," she said, her voice weaker than she would have liked. However, Oliver ignored the invitation. His focus was on the document proving the amount he believed he rightfully deserved. "I just want to make sure my name is on there as one of the beneficiaries. Samuel has no right to anything, right?" "He isn't really one of us," Oliver said with a coldness that cut through the air. His words, harsh and direct, fell like stones into the silence of the room. Samuel felt a tightening in his heart. Not just from the contempt Oliver's words revealed, but also from the painful indifference towards their mother's condition. Sarah, on her part, tried to hide her pain, but her eyes revealed the sadness of seeing a son so far removed from the love and compassion that she and Michael had always tried to nurture. Oliver reviewed the papers quickly, his eyes only scanning the lines that confirmed his interests. With a grunt of satisfaction upon seeing his name properly listed, he barely glanced at Samuel or his ailing mother, and without another word announced that he had other commitments and needed to leave. This brief and tense encounter made clear the emotional chasm Oliver had created between himself and his family. Samuel, still in shock at the harshness of his brother, stayed by his mother's side, offering her the silent comfort that his words could never provide. The money, which should have been a small relief in the tide of challenges, became a new point of rupture, highlighting Oliver's true priorities. When the compensation for Michael's death was finally processed and released, Oliver showed his true colors with shocking clarity. He arrived at the house on a cloudy Tuesday, his expression stern and his eyes quickly scanning the documents spread across the kitchen table where Samuel and Sarah were seated. "So, has this been settled?" Oliver asked, his voice laden with impatience, making no effort to disguise his direct interest in the money. There were no greetings or any concern for Sarah's debilitated state, who watched him with deep sadness in her eyes. Samuel, feeling a knot of frustration in his stomach, nodded and passed the documents to Oliver. As he took the papers, Oliver quickly flipped through to the distribution clauses. Make sure my name is on there. Samuel has no right to anything, he isn't really one of us, said Oliver, his words slicing through the cold air of the room with a chill that made Samuel shudder. Sarah tried to intervene. Oliver, please, now is not the time. Mom, I'm just stating the facts. It's nothing personal against Samuel, but you know, things have to be fair. I am your biological son. The money should rightfully be mine. The disregard and cruelty in Oliver's voice were palpable. Samuel, who until that moment had held on to the hope that perhaps his brother might eventually recognize the gravity of the family situation, felt that hope completely fade away. The rejection was not just about the compensation, it was a rejection of his place in the family, a clear declaration that he was seen as an outsider. The tensions that were already evident between the two brothers intensified even further after this interaction. Samuel stayed by his mother's side, whose health continued to deteriorate, while Oliver, with the compensation secured, quickly left the house, leaving behind a silence loaded with unspoken words and open wounds. The emotional distance between him and Samuel, now deeper than ever, seemed irreparable. In the last days of her life, with her health increasingly fragile, Sarah dedicated herself to preparing a very special surprise for Samuel. She knew she didn't have much time left and wanted to ensure that she would leave something truly meaningful for the son she had chosen with so much love. While Oliver was only concerned with the compensation and what he could gain from the situation, Sarah thought about Samuel's emotional legacy and roots, something that no amount of money could buy or replace. With the help of a neighbor and friend, Sarah organized a small wooden box. Inside, she placed meticulously organized documents, a letter she had written, explaining how Samuel was found and how much he had been loved from the very first moment, photos from their first days as a family, and most importantly, information about his biological origin, including a letter from Samuel's uncle, who had secretly entrusted him to Sarah and Michael for a better life. Sarah called Samuel to her room, handed him the box, and said with a voice weak but full of love, "My dear Samuel, this box contains more than papers and photographs. It contains your history and my love, which is eternal. You have always been a true son to me, as dear as any child born to me. I love you, never doubt that." After Sarah's peaceful passing on a quiet afternoon, Samuel found himself alone in the room where he had shared many conversations and smiles with his mother. With the wooden box that Sarah had given him, he sat on the floor, his heart tightened by the pain of loss, yet also moved by curiosity about the contents his mother considered so important. He slowly opened the box, almost with reverence, and began to explore the documents and objects it contained. Among them, he found a time-yellowed letter written in shaky but clear handwriting. It was from his uncle, his biological mother's brother, revealing a story Samuel had never imagined. The uncle wrote about his sister's difficult decision, unable to care for a baby at that time in her life, who passed away from an overdose a few years later, and how he, after much searching and consideration, had decided that the best for Samuel would be to live in a home where he was loved and cared for as he deserved. He explained how he had kept track of Samuel's upbringing from a distance, always in contact with Sarah and Michael, ensuring he was well, but choosing to remain anonymous to not complicate Samuel's emotions. Further in the letter, the uncle expressed his final wishes, revealing that he had left an inheritance for Samuel. It wasn't just a financial aid gesture, but a sign that, although they were not together, the family bond was real and meaningful. Samuel's uncle had arranged his finances so that after his death, a substantial part of his savings would go to the nephew he only knew from afar. As Samuel read those words, he felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for never having met the uncle who clearly loved him in such a deep and true way, gratitude for the life his adoptive parents had provided, and a new sense of connection with the biological family he never knew he had. The last words of the letter, "You have always been one of us, even without knowing it," deeply touched his heart, filling him with new strength and purpose. Samuel now not only carried the legacy of love from Sarah and Michael but also the legacy of his uncle, a legacy of courage and connection. With these discoveries, he felt he could face the future not as an orphan, but as someone whose roots, although complicated, were deeply embedded in love and familial regard. Samuel now understood that life, like the box full of memories and revelations, was layered. Each photo, each line in the letters from his adoptive mother and biological uncle, each small object he held between his fingers, told a story of love, loss, and hope. With these discoveries he began to shape his future, determined to live up to the name given to him and the life his adoptive parents, Michael and Sarah, had dreamed for him. He immersed himself in studies, absorbing knowledge as if it were a living homage to the zest for life that his parents had instilled in him. And with the inheritance his uncle had left him, Samuel not only funded his education but also reached out to those in need. He knew that generosity was a way to keep his family's essence alive, a way to tell the world that the legacy of Michael and Sarah would continue through his deeds. Samuel dreamed of starting his own family, of passing on to his future children the values that had been so lovingly taught to him. He wanted to be for his children what his parents had been for him, a source of unconditional love, a guide, a safe harbor in any storm. Meanwhile, Oliver lived a bitter reality. Years of partying and seeking immediate gratification had left him empty and alone. The mornings after nights out no longer brought company or comfort, but rather an oppressive silence and a painful questioning of what really mattered. Gradually he began to see the ruins of his past choices and the loneliness he had created around himself. He wandered through the rooms of his childhood, now silent, feeling the weight of every harsh word he had directed at Samuel, of every disdainful look towards Sarah's efforts. The remorse that once lightly pricked his conscience now consumed him, making him wish he could go back in time and choose differently. And in the quiet of the night, Oliver felt the deepest of loneliness. Away from the noise and lights, he faced the reality that he had traded the family's gold for the fleeting glitter of party faux gold. Now, looking at his reflection in the mirror, he began to understand the depth of what he had lost. In a rare moment of clarity, Oliver wondered if there was still time to change. Could Samuel, who had been more a son to Michael and Sarah than he himself had been, forgive him? Could he rebuild the bridges he had burned? With a heavy heart, Oliver knew there was no other choice but to try. The answer was in every beat of his lonely heart. Family was the answer, the beginning of his journey towards redemption.